Welcome to our last lesson for Chapter 11. This is Lesson 11.4. We're going to talk about preserving biodiversity and then just a quick summary of all of Chapter 11. All of Chapter 11, we've been talking about biodiversity, threats to it, why we care about it, and now how we can save it. So learning goal or lesson goal is that you will be able to identify and describe the current steps we are taking to preserve our world's biodiversity. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and describe legal protection that exists to protect biodiversity and endangered species, and identify what humans do to assess and manage biological communities and ecosystems. So we're going to talk about species level approaches first. So we're going to start with listings and legal protections. The big one is the IUCN Red List, which stands for the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List of Threatened Species. So they carry out species assessments and they'll rate species on this kind of scale here. They're either not evaluated, not enough data, not concerned, or they are critically endangered, possibly extinct in the wild, or even fully extinct. And that's categorizing that threat status. So usually we will see them as critically endangered. That's when they'll get that protection. They could just be endangered, or one step below would be vulnerable. And so we have that, those three are going to be in that threatened status, and they have a greater risk of extinction. So the U.S. has the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and it's a mandate that creates and maintains a list of endangered and threatened species, and they help to identify and protect critical habitat and develop recovery programs. And then CITES aims to ensure that international trade in wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. So the U.S. Endangered Species Act, that is U.S. specific. CITES helps to cover that international trade to protect it beyond in the U.S. All right, the next is population assessments and management. So we do repeated censuses, which means we can measure and keep track of changes in population size over time. So we can see if those populations are increasing or decreasing. We can also see how a population responds to changes in the environment. And we also do demographic studies. So we look at rates of growth, reproduction, and survival, percentage of breeding adults, and the total number of populations of that species. So we can also see the movement among populations, so that migration and immigration from one population to another. Within that, we also have habitat management. So habitat management is habitat modification made to enhance the success of a species. One example of that is prescribed fire. So naturally, without human influences, fires are very common in nature. Grasslands use fires to help keep trees at bay. Forests, fires are useful, sometimes for seed germination, but also getting rid of too much of the litter on the bottom of the forest. So fires are a natural thing. We as humans don't love fires, and so we usually put them out immediately, to the point where a lot of our forests have gotten overgrown or have too much kind of like waste on the bottom of the forest floor. So we have prescribed fire to kind of bring that habitat back. Another example is managing water levels in wetlands. We can also establish new populations. So we could do reintroductions where species are released on a site where they used to occur but maybe were removed. One example is the wolves in Yellowstone that were hunted to extinction and then many years later were reintroduced to help balance that ecosystem. And there can also be a population augmentation, where individuals are released into an existing population to increase its size and gene pool. There's also ex situ approaches, and that is temporarily maintaining individuals in artificial conditions, because ex situ means off-site. So this has the long-term goal of establishing them back into the wild. This happens in some zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, and also in seed banks. So not all zoos and aquariums do this, but many do, where they will be like a rehabilitation center to then re-release these animals or organisms back into the wild. So going off of species level approaches and onto ecosystem and landscape approaches, we can also have protected areas. So protected areas are clearly defined geographical space which is recognized and dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem and services and cultural values. So the protection level can differ. Sometimes it means no humans, sometimes it means just restricted access. It depends on the needs of that area, but it is to protect that habitat. There's also ecological restoration, and restoration is the return of an ecosystem to its original state, which we sometimes can do really well, and sometimes we're just getting close. And then rehabilitation improves a system relative to its degraded state, and usually that degradation is because of human impact. And then reclamation is restoring highly degraded sites, so sites that maybe weren't even livable anymore. We are able to bring them back as habitat. And then we can have regional ecosystem planning, and that's planning of protected areas, managed lands, and human activities that can coexist across the landscape. Scale and complexity for this can be large, but it's an attempt to balance ecosystem conservation with human well-being. So it's protecting that habitat, maybe restoring that habitat, but also having it there for at least moderate human use. All right. Here's our summary of chapter 11. So this goes all the way back to lesson 1. Hopefully every bullet point here feels familiar. If it does not, we probably need to talk. But first, loss of biodiversity has become a major concern. Ecosystems involve the interactions of organisms and their physical environment. Functioning ecosystems and their component organisms provide many valuable services that are often overlooked because they are not easily measured in economic terms. We as humans really like to have an explanation and compartment for everything, but nature doesn't always work that way. Many people also consider the loss of biodiversity to be an ethical problem, but the primary causes of habitat loss are by humans converting ecosystems to agriculture and grazing, overexploitation or overusing by harvesting species at unsustainable levels, so levels where we're taking them up so fast that they can't grow back, introduction of exotic species that disrupt ecosystems and compete or prey on native organisms, and then also the purposeful killing of pest organisms such as large predators. Pest organisms to humans, like we don't like them because maybe they're a danger to us or they are an annoyance to us, but they do play a role in the natural world. And then protection of biodiversity typically involves legal protections by national laws and international agreements and management of the use of species and ecosystems at sustainable levels. That is the end of chapter 11. That is the end of unit 1. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let me know, and I will see you in the next one.